From Charleston, the northward course returned through Georgetown, where a station was also established, and where William Hickson, a man of brilliant genius and fine enthusiasm, was put in charge. This remarkable man died a year or two later of consumption. Wilmington was visited on March 19th, and on April 20th, Asbury and Lee reached Green Hills on Tar River in North Carolina. Green Hill was a wealthy planter, a slaveholder, and a local Methodist preacher. His position was an anomalous one in view of the Methodist rule and force at that time, but he was a man of God and wrought and hoped for the perfect coming of the kingdom. In after years, he migrated to the Cumberland Valley and helped to plant and support Methodism in that Eden of Middle Tennessee. At the conference held in the spring of 1784, one of the three sittings appointed for 1785 was designated to meet at his house. The date in the minutes is April 29th, but the session occurred 9 days later. This was to accommodate Dr. Coke, who was present and presided, while Asbury stationed the preachers, which he uniformly did, Dr. Coke deferring to his superior knowledge of the men and the field. This conference, which has the distinction of being the first conference of the Methodist Episcopal Church after its organization, was held according to appointment in Reverend Greenhill's house, which was spacious and comfortable. The entire membership of the conference, including 2 general superintendents and almost 20 preachers from North Carolina and Virginia, were entertained under the same hospitable roof. The results of Asbury's tour are seen in the appointments made at this conference. Such circuits as New River, Camden, Georgetown, Charleston, and Georgia appearing in the list for the first time. Beverly Allen was the man to whom all Georgia was given for a field. Alas, that one who for a time was permitted to hold in the hollow of his hand the spiritual possibilities of a commonwealth should have ended his career so meanly. But thus was history pledged in those beginning days. Thus, in that then remote Southwest, was started the cause which, through a century and a quarter, has grown mightily in the records of the kingdom. 10 years later, the 2 general superintendents attended together the conference sitting in Virginia. The question of slavery was uppermost with the Methodists at this time, the occasion being a petition which the conference was sent to the Virginia State Assembly, asking for the immediate or gradual emancipation of the slaves. It was agreed at the Virginia session that Coke and Asbury should visit General Washington and solicit his aid in presenting this document. On May 26th, they were courteously received and dined at Mount Vernon. Washington readily gave them his opinion on slavery, which was depreciatory, but he declined to sign the petition. This appears to have been the end of the scheme. And at the Baltimore Conference, which occurred 1 week later, the minute on slavery was temporarily suspended. The temperate judgment of Washington on this question, expressed at a crucial hour, proved to be of immense advantage to Methodism. Profiting by his views, which were practically those of the Methodists of the South, so long as slavery continued, to be an institution, the Church entered upon an era of soberer legislation than had been in contemplation, and thus was left unhampered in its ministry to both master and slave. With the opening of the Baltimore Conference, Asbury completed his first official round as general superintendent. I'm still catching that there's, obey your slave master and wickedness, and don't complain if the government abuses you, or that sort of stuff. I'm still seeing sermons on that with Bible verses being done places. I'm not going around to churches and seeing and attending these sermons, but 4. The distance traveled. For the distance traveled, the labors accomplished, and the variety of offices performed, it was by far the most considerable and most important single round he had ever made. But as his after experiences proved, it was but the beginning of miracles in this line. With the close of the conference, Dr. Coke took leave of the brethren in America and called for England to meet the criticisms of both Methodists and churchmen. When he arrived, the people in and out of the establishment, who at this time understood the merits of Wesley's plan for the settlement of American Methodism, could have been counted upon the fingers of the founder's 2 hands, but Coke saw enough with his own eyes while in America to give him a confidence that no amount of misjudgment could shake. Asbury was again alone in the headship of the church. He also had upon his hands most of the problems which he had before Coke's coming, and not a few new ones. Among the latter, none was more difficult than that of the projected college at Cokesbury. A century and a quarter has shown that the building and endowing of a denominational college is an undertaking for men of the will and endurance of giants. Before Coke's coming, Asbury had planned a school like Kingswood in England, but Coke wanted a college. The faith and intellectual responsiveness of Asbury embraced at once the idea of his collegian associate, not dreaming of the unrewarded toils and baffled hopes for which it was to stand in his life. In June, following the session of the Christmas conference, the foundations of the college building were laid, and Asbury preached at the commemoration. This sermon, delivered in the hot and open summer air, completed a collapse upon the verge of which he had been trembling for some time. The invalidism which followed forced upon him a season of rest, which he spent partially at Perry Hall and partially at the American Bath, the famous warm springs of Virginia. Being in a good degree recovered by midsummer, he was again active, but for the remainder of the year confined himself mainly to journeys in the peninsula and contiguous parts. The order and arrangement of the lately published form of discipline became about this time a matter of criticism on account of its lack of heads and divisions. The usefulness of the volume was greatly lessened. This defect Asbury set himself to remedy, and out of his work has grown that order of sections, paragraphs, and indices that make the present day discipline an open book to the most inexperienced undergraduate in the ministry. The first conference for 1786 was to be held at Salisbury in February, and the journey thither was begun soon after New Year's. The advance was in course, crudely conforming to a great half circle, with Charleston on the outer plane of the arc. To detail The experiences of that long horseback ride across 3 commonwealths and back in midwinter would be to repeat details already made familiar in this narrative, but commonplace as they were, they played their part in a great apostolic plan. The sermons, private appeals, and oversight, and spyings out advantages for future stations were like golden wheat grains cast in amongst the snow crystals and ice shards of a winter field to wake and fruit in after days. It was by such plottings and toilings as these that the empire of Methodism was built up. And apostolic, if you see opportunity and you say, oh, I could take advantage of that opportunity, that's not the same thing as apostolic. But titles and terms are misused to uplift certain church claims and to cast them down at the same time. It's depends on who's saying it and what. An Asbury's journal of this year, mention is made of a book concern. This infant enterprise was under the care of John Dickens, an Etonian, of whose capabilities and attainments mention has already been made. This norm of vast and varied publishing interests today was at first simply a depository in one room of the preacher's house in Philadelphia for the few books, disciplines, hymn books, Wesleyan standards, tracts, etc., which were in demand among the Methodists. But even at this time, Asbury mentions that a collection was taken under that head. Another principal idea of Methodist propagandism began also to take its root about this time. On April 30th, 1786, Asbury called for a public collection to provide funds for sending missionaries to the western settlements. And the simple means employed for handling and directing this collection is seen the remote parentage of the many missionary societies of American Methodism, receiving and dispersing in the 20th century millions of dollars yearly for the evangelization of the world. Asbury was now greatly cheered with the outlook of the church, not only the day of its liberation, but the day of its entering into heritage seemed to have come. With one accord, the people hailed the new order. Church building became general. The revival was spreading, and churchly enterprises of many sorts were taking shape. The new discipline was working as though it had a century of testing. The Methodist spirit was winding along with the spirit of the new nation. Prophecy occurred in the labors of the homely band of Methodist itinerants. They published their message daily in the face of the sun. And a lot of churches, there's sort of a generalness that you can tell, oh, well, it's this, this is the style that this church type of, that this church chain is built in, to the point where I've heard of people, it's not just LDS people, but other churches. It's like, oh, well, there's a series of these churches, but I forget which one I'm at, because it's, the building is so much like the other, like another one, like 20 miles away or 5 miles away or something. The Baltimore Session, the Determinative and Lawmaking Council, opened on May 8th at Eppington. It had been hoped to sit in the college, but alas, the walls were now only fit for covering, and a debt of more than $4,000 had already accumulated. This was an incubus indeed, and money scarce. sighed the weary Asbury as he remembered his toils past and his toils yet to come. It was enough to discomfit the most intrepid. As for Asbury, his training did not answer to the task, and for it he had no zest. He was a preacher, a kingdom builder, and not a money raiser or a college agent. Yet in these things he also laid a foundation. 60 circuits were listed this year, against 46 at the time of the Christmas conference. In the appointments for the year appears for the first time the romantic name Kentucky. This was one of those western settlements for which the first regularly collected missionary money for the church was appropriated. In the year of the Christmas conference, 15,000 members with 93 preachers had been reported, while at the conference of this year, 1786, the returns had credited to the connection more than 20,000 members and 117 pastors. The most noteworthy experience of Asbury during the remaining months of this year was a ride across the Alleghanies to a point on the Ohio River, where he went to satisfy himself of the prospects in that then the most western west of America. As he went out, he overrode the western moving emigrant groups, and as he returned, he met their ox-drawn caravans, and now he realized, as never before, the necessity for mobilizing his forces toward the frontier. He read a new meaning out of his own early motto, a circulation of the preachers. From this loud calling west, he returned only to be mocked by a return, at frequent intervals, of his old maladies. Often they mastered him, and for whole fortnights together he was laid up, but he rallied from each attack and completed his convalescence in labors and travels, through heat and cold, through drought and rain and snow. At Christmastide, he was in Baltimore, settling the yearly affairs of the book concern and struggling with that horse leech problem, the Cokesbury College debt. Thousands had been spent upon the building, and still not a hall or a chamber was tenantable, but great duties lightened their own burdens through variety. With the new year, he was off for another extended southern tour, Charleston, as before, being the objective. While passing through Virginia, he was entertained by a famous heroine of Christ, Mrs. Ball, who was a kinswoman of Mary, the mother of Washington. She had espoused the faith as preached by the Methodists, and continued to the end of her life a faithful exponent of the doctrines of the Church. The name of Ball is still an honored one in Methodism. Of the Old Dominion. After a journey, during which Bishop Hurst says he showed an infinite disregard of fatigue, Asbury came on March 15th, 1787, to Charleston, where he met Dr. Coke, who had but lately arrived from England. From Charleston, the two general superintendents proceeded together to Salisbury, where the first conference of the year was held some days later. The minutes of 1786 had fixed the date for May 17th, but it was changed by Dr. Coke while yet in Europe to suit his traveling convenience, as were those dates of the conferences in Virginia and in Maryland, and thereby hangs a whole chapter of American Methodist history, further reference to which will be made as this narrative proceeds. So was George Washington one of those that was that offense was found with in regarding their deism. And, you know, perhaps looking up to him in other matters, shouldn't that be more than enough? But it could be a point that they would that would be put to the side and not repeated much if George Washington was one of those people. Dr. Koch had not wholly pleased the American during the 5 months of his first official visit, but they had not failed to see his good points and endorsed him as an unselfish man and a zealous servant of the master. They also greatly respected his ability and learning, and were justly proud of his championship. His aristocratic manners were atoned for by his cordial endorsement of the American Republic and his expressed admiration of its leaders. But what the preachers secretly objected to was his betrayal of a sense of authority. They accepted the episcopacy with the understanding that the incumbent of the office was to be the servant of his brethren, the first among equals. But Koch's ideal of the episcopacy was Anglican. Moreover, he understood that the government of the church was to remain in the hands of Mr. Wesley in much the same way as that of the connection in England. As the representative of Mr. Wesley, he therefore felt that in America what his power was that of a patriarch. This was not the view of either the preachers or Francis Asbury. From the beginning, Asbury had questioned the wisdom of agreeing to obey a man 3,000 miles away. The review at the Baltimore Conference, the determinative session of the arbitrary action of Koch in changing the dates of the annual sittings, brought this whole matter to an issue. The contest was sharp, and for a time the little doctor attempted to justify his course. "You must consider yourselves my equals," he retorted sharply upon Nelson Reed, one of his aggressive critics in the conference lists. "Yes, sir," was the spirited reply, "we do. And we are not only the equals of Dr. Koch, but of Dr. Koch's king." There was too great a fire of Americanism burning in the bones of the lesser clergy for him to hold out. To satisfy his displeased and outspoken brethren, he submitted a written pledge that he would exercise no function of his office while absent in Europe or elsewhere, that he would lay claim to no authority when in America except to preside over the conference, ordain, and travel and preach in the connection. A record of this transaction appears in the minutes of this year, but a much more important matter than this, though one related to it, was this year determined by the joint action of the Virginia and Baltimore sessions. Mr. Wesley had instructed Dr. Koch to call a general conference to meet at Baltimore May 1st, 1787, and had requested the election of Richard Watcote to the joint superintendency with Asbury and Freeborn Garretson for superintendent in Nova Scotia. At the Christmas conference, the preachers had, by a unanimous vote, bound themselves during the lifetime of the Reverend Mr. Wesley to obey his commands in matters belonging to church government. Here was an embarrassing record. Some of the preachers, seeing that they were not present when the agreement was entered into, refused to be bound by it. The general interpretation was that the agreement referred to the forms of polity and administration, and not to those details of election and legislation which come properly under these forms. The utmost that the agreement was thought to signify was the union of the worldwide Methodism under Mr. Wesley during his lifetime. It was now plain that the action had been a mistake. the time had come to undo it. The result was that no general conference was held. The nominations of Mr. Wesley were not considered, and furthermore, by formal action, the rule of submission to Mr. Wesley was stricken from the discipline. The revised and rearranged book of discipline upon which General Superintendent Asbury and Book Steward John Dickens had been at work since 1785 was published immediately after the conference of 1787 and conforms to the several actions above described. Thus it was that the autonomy and independence of American Methodism were asserted, and its constitution prophesied within 2½ years after the adjournment of the Christmas Conference. The powers of the episcopacy had been defined and settled, and the rights of the preachers reserved. It was also by action of the conference of this year that the official title, General Superintendent, was rendered into its equivalent as used in the English Scriptures, and General Superintendent Asbury became Bishop Asbury. As for his associate in office, the honorary title of doctor was then so rare a dignity that the Methodists in both hemispheres declined to know him otherwise than as Dr. Coke. The 5 bishops of the church between Coke and Sola lived and died without honorary degrees, and almost without exception, the men of their generation also wore unembellished names. Is it Soul? How are you really supposed to say that guy's name? How different the case today. Titles which, in the times of the fathers, stood for exceptional attainments in scholarship and learning have now come to be so promiscuously and even recklessly conferred that they are no longer a certain guarantee of even respectable literary equipment. And so one of the things we saw in this chapter is sort of, okay, you've got into the position, but where is your loyalty? Is it to your personal interest? Is it towards the conservative interest? Is it towards the state? Is it to directly what you think God's order to be, as directly interpreted by yourself, but not merely in a satisfying of your own whims? Sort of, oh, I'm going to justify myself through religion. That's not the same thing as the other way around of religion's justified, so I'm going to mold myself to it.